Welcome to Adventures in Relationship, a psychoeducational show about healthy relationships for adults with complex trauma. I'm Amy Gordon, an individual and couple psychotherapist working on unceded Tiwa land in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I also offer virtual therapy, so reach out if you want to work with me individually or as a couple. This episode is about scapegoating, but I'm going to be panning in and out of micro and macro manifestations of scapegoating between systems and families and romantic relationships, maybe even other systems, including internal family systems, because the pattern is really the same. And I'm hoping you're going to start seeing it after listening to this or watching, of course. Scapegoating is a term for what happens when harm is taking place, but accountability would be too destabilizing or perceived to be too destabilizing for whatever the system, whether that's inter or intrapersonal. So the system maintains a homeostasis and someone carries all the blame, or in kind of a larger framework, people of a certain identity carry all the blame. Zoomed out, this happens in capitalism, patriarchy, psychology, medicine, and other systems. Zoomed in, this happens at work, in families, or in couples. And when I say intrapersonally, this might be like parts of you, parts that are scapegoated. We have scapegoat parts. Oftentimes, they're the more, we call them firefighters in IFS. So they're the ones who get loud. They're the ones who overeat or use substances. They're the more kind of perceived to be destructive parts. But in any case, someone or a group of people, or even a part of you, non consensually absorbs the pressure in that system, and usually for a long, long time. It's a really frustrating role, but it's so confusing that scapegoats usually adapt and overfunction and self silence, oftentimes until their nervous system can't keep it up and they somehow reject their role, which unfortunately looks to others like more or more extreme bad behavior. Traditionally speaking, like in the field of psychotherapy, the scapegoat is a role within dysfunctional families where one individual is unfairly blamed, shamed, and targeted for the group's problems and repressed emotions as well. So they act as the scapegoat, that is, acts as a dumping ground for negative, unresolved feelings, protecting the family's image and allowing others to avoid accountability. And that is usually somebody in a role that has power, usually a parent, right? But the phenomenon of scapegoating doesn't only occur in families. You can think of a secretary who keeps getting blamed because his employer can't find certain files because the employer implemented a shitty system of organization. But the scapegoat, the secretary, might end up talking back one day to his boss. And that is the like more extreme bad behavior where people tend to point the finger even more. Another example might be a wife who was cheated on early in marriage. And maybe she drinks excessively to deal with her constant feelings of resentment and insecurity. She's constantly criticized for her drinking by her spouse and maybe others. And one day she just flies off the handle into a rage toward her spouse. But because she was drinking before or during this rage, she's not taken seriously in her complaints, but she's rather further condemned for her drinking. So that's a scapegoat role. Another example might be a laborer who finally goes on strike after more and more unsafe and unreasonable expectations are placed upon them in the workplace. But they're seen as even less respectable, even less professional after taking a stand and refusing to work in their protests. So when this happens, what shows up on the surface is symptoms, whether that's resistance or coldness and withdrawal, or it could be passive aggressive or even angry outbursts. But accumulated resentment eventually begins to express itself. It's like a volcano. It builds up under the surface, and at some point, it's got to burst. But the real problem isn't seen for what it is. The perpetrator gets off scot free, and the victim looks like the problem. This is how scapegoating works. We respond to the visible rupture instead of the invisible conditions that made the rupture inevitable in the first place. The scapegoat's just like the person in the wrong place at the wrong time, in a sense. In mental health, we call this pathology. That is to say, the field's view is that there's something wrong with you rather than there's something that's been really wrong around you for a long time. It's a lot easier to say, you have a chemical imbalance or you have distorted cognitions than it is to say, capitalist patriarchy is incompatible with human nervous systems. Just like it's easier to say in a relationship, you're bitter or you've changed than it is to say, we've never addressed a disturbing power imbalance in our marriage. In families, this often looks like one person being labeled the difficult one, the angry one, the addict, the troubled kid, the juvenile delinquent. And there is actually a family role that is called the problem child, which is a scapegoat role. But the kid is reacting to the family system, and that family structure itself remains unquestioned. This could also be, I'm just going to go with like the statistically most accurate dynamic where there's an abusive father, but the mother drinks excessively. And I know I'm bringing in drinking again, but it is a really common issue. And let's say the mother is scapegoated for the drinking, but she's drinking to cope with impossible emotions that have to do with her marriage and this person who's living in this household tormenting everybody. I remember in my own family of origin experience, rarely being in the role of scapegoat, but thinking and even vocalizing to our family's scapegoat things like, why can't you just get it together? Why don't you just shut up and put up like the rest of us? And that attitude really just adds to the harm and dysfunction. Not that I was a child, so I don't blame myself for that. But in retrospect, I can see how I was a part of that system. It's so unconscious and insidious to really most family members. And it took me well into my adulthood to recognize how much harm was done to my sibling, not only through their interactions with my parent, but by our entire family through buying into our system of family roles. In couples, scapegoating occurs after one partner stays silent about problematic dynamics for years, often swallowing their disappointment and carrying an unfair degree of physical or emotional labor for so long that resentment finally surfaces. But that resentment is treated as the issue. Oftentimes, and really common historically, this partner is a woman in a straight relationship. And not surprisingly, she's seen as having mental, emotional, or behavioral health issues. We used to use the word hysteria in my field quite a bit. Nowadays, it's more like depression and so on. But the fields of psychology and psychiatry have done a terrible job of identifying chronic invalidation and unmet needs and lack of sensitivity or justice within relationships as the real problem. Another aspect of scapegoating that can be important to keep in mind in romantic relationships is that if a person has been chronically scapegoated, whether in society, work, previous relationships, or their family of origin, they're likely sensitive to feeling scapegoated, even if they aren't conscious of their sensitivity. They're aware on some level that they resent being blamed and may buck any complaint or accusation that rubs against their scapegoat wound. And I'm not going to get into specifics of how to work with this on this particular episode, but it's something to consider if you or your partner really struggle with constructive feedback. And this isn't to say that it's okay to buck constructive feedback in your relationship. I'm just pointing to a sensitivity that affects a lot of relationships. So, moving on to the macro level of medicine, psychology, and mental health fields, this pattern has severely harmed children, women, people of color, people with disabilities, and really people with any identity that is systemically disenfranchised. These fields have been far more comfortable attempting to correct individuals than they are in confronting systems. Most early psychologists and physicians were paid by husbands, fathers, and to a lesser extent, employers, not by their patients directly. They were hired hands when a woman became too difficult in a lot of cases. And they were hired to return patients to compliance with their benefactors. So, disclosures of abuse by fathers, husbands, and other men with power were predictably reframed as fantasy, exaggeration, and pathology. Hysteria became a way to discredit testimony, and to this day, all people who don't conform to great white father's expectations are pathologized in this field, in the field of mental health. The DSM is written from a lens of pathologizing people who struggle to get with the program. Treatment is often about silencing, and distress caused by oppression is often reframed as an internal deficit of some sort. When systems are the source of harm, the harmed become inconvenient witnesses as far as the system is concerned. So the system scapegoats these folks and tries to get them to shut up. We're often medicalized, managed, and pathologized. There is a new DSM being produced, by the way. It might have a few bits of improvement, but I just want to mention that it's basically the same in this regard, pointing to individual issues rather than to societal conditions that produced the mental emotional suffering in most folks. We see the same maneuver in environmental discourse. You've probably been told to buy metal and paper straws because we're damaging the environment. Meanwhile, industries inflict massive destruction to the planet, but they're pointing to us. They're pointing to your straw. Wielding a McDonald's Coke with a straw makes me a scapegoat, just as the chemical imbalance in my brain becomes the focus rather than our sick overculture. And a resentful partner is a bitch to be around, with no consideration for all she's suffering at home. When responsibility is individualized, systems of harm are protected. When resentment is isolated, relational power stays hidden. This doesn't mean that biology isn't real and that individuals don't impact their own mental health, but we can't overlook the context. Healing without context becomes another form of gaslighting. If a partner is cold or withdrawn, that doesn't automatically mean that they're emotionally avoidant or argumentative. It means that something has been chronically unaddressed in their relationship most of the time. Scapegoating thrives when we conflate symptoms with the source of dysfunction or confuse compliance with health, for that matter. What I'm hoping you'll take away from this episode is a shift in perception from judgment to curiosity by asking not who is the problem, but what conditions made their response necessary. Gabor Mate has a great quote about people with chemical addictions that applies really well here. I'm paraphrasing, but what he says is that the question isn't why the addiction, but why the pain. Symptoms and dysfunction don't arise in a vacuum, is really the point. So when systems are sick, individuals show symptoms. When relationships are imbalanced, resentment will surface, but the symptom is not the cause. And quite frankly, scapegoats are often the healthiest ones in the system who've realized that they no longer want to cooperate with obligatory denial. Please know that if you're struggling with feelings of burnout and resentment, it might be because you've been scapegoated, as all of us 99% have to some extent. But some have been severely and violently scapegoated to the extent of unimaginable harm. We need to carry more awareness of how this happens if we want it to change. I hope we can all refuse to carry blame that belongs to systems and refuse to label our survival strategies as pathology. Please consider if your resentment is a response to harmful conditions. Thank you for watching or listening. Please get professional help online or locally if you're struggling. I'm a therapist, but I'm not your therapist. Please don't rely on podcasts or webcasts as your primary mental health support. And take good care of yourself and also your partner if you're committed. I promise you don't have to abandon yourself to do so. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this podcast today. My mission is to help adults with complex trauma find emotional freedom and learn how to thrive in relationships. So, if you can take a moment to follow, rate, review, or share this episode, it's immensely helpful. Thank you so much for watching or listening again. Till next time.